What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the third part of our PSD to HTML tutorial. This time around we are going to be looking at CSS functionality. We're going to style up our header and our footer, some of our subfooter, and work on the base CSS of our site. The next video, or depending on how long this one is, we may get started on some of the styling up of our content. We'll see how far we can get. So to start off, what I'm going to do is create a styles folder that'll hold all of my CSS files. That way they're easy to find. They're not cluttered in with images or anything like that. I'm going to now create a reset style sheet. Now what a CSS reset does is that it allows, or it forces all web browsers to zero out. So for example, the unordered list, if we look at it in the web browser, we have the bullets. Now it's not so much of a problem as it is now than it was, quote unquote, back in the day. For instance, between Firefox, before Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and Safari would render all of these differently. One would use padding for the bullets, the other one would use margin for the bullets, and real inconsistent. Headers sometimes would have different font sizes on the browser, different margins for it, and so what this does is that it sets everything back to square one. That way you're working with the absolute basic core. It's going to change our CSS for this page a lot, which is, it's not a bad thing. Now if you're working strictly with newer browsers, normalize.css is a good option. I think that's what it is. So it's a little bit more consistent. It doesn't support legacy versions of IE. The website we're cutting out doesn't technically support it. I'm personally just a bigger fan of the CSS Reset, done by Eric Meyer. He's kind of like, people claim he's kind of the grandfather of CSS development. Yeah, kind of the guru to end all gurus for him, I guess. So yeah, this is typically my fallback. I usually keep a copy of it saved, but if you go to meyerweb.com, you can grab a copy of the CSS Reset. He does point out this is a starting point. This is not the end all of resets. So what we're going to do is we're going to take his reset and mold it into what we're going to use. So for instance, on this top one we see all these different HTML elements. We're going to cut out all the ones that we know we aren't going to use. So applet, iframe, we're not going to use those. We are going to use all the header tags and the paragraph tag. We don't use pre or block quotes. We're going to pull that out. All these on line 8, with the exception of the A tag, we are not going to use. Del, definition, and emphasis, we're not going to use. Not going to use any of those. Small, strike, strong, sub, TT, var, not going to use any of those. The old B, UI, center, don't use those. We're not going to use a definition list. In this instance, we don't even use an ordered list. We use an unordered list. Then field set, we have no forms, so we don't need any of those. We don't have any tables or anything of the such, so we don't need those. None of those. Figure, caption, don't need those. We do have a footer and a header, so we're going to keep those. Do have a nav, but no menu. Let's see here, Ruby, section, summary, none of those. last comma, format our document, make it look a little bit prettier. So there, we've cut it down drastically. Now the reason why we do that is because one of the reasons why I do that is because the browser is going to look for those elements and try to apply those rules if it does find it. If the browser doesn't know to look for it, you don't have to worry about it. So then in these, so what this does is what this block of CSS does is makes all the HTML5 elements block level. So it helps out with older browsers, but I hit my caps lock, I think. Yeah. But it doesn't actually make them work 100%. You have to use a bit of JavaScript to get these to work. Also, you have to do a document.create element, I believe. There's HTML5 shiv that will that you can use for that. We're gonna undo our list styles since we don't have bullet lists. We don't have block quotes, so we're gonna delete that. And we don't have a table, so we get rid of that. And so what we have here is a very slimmed down version of the CSS Reset. Sets our margins and paddings, which is usually one of the problems with browsers across the board. Everybody sets stuff a little bit different. Remove our borders, set our font size to 100%, vertical line, baseline, line height, list style. Alright, so we're going to hop back into our HTML and we're going to include our CSS Reset into our header tag, or our head tag, I'm sorry. That way our browser processes the CSS first before it renders. So that way you don't get a flash of unstyled content. So we're going to go back over, and so pay attention to how this page changed. Everything's reset to next to nothing, and we now have images for those. So all of our headers tags lost all their styling, and we're going to go back in and update that. So we're going to create a base CSS for to use for this site. So we're just going to call it base. So the first element we're going to style is our body tag. So if you look inside our primary, or if we look inside our PSD, the primary background color we see across all the content is this textured background. Since I'm going to cheat a little bit, not cut it out, I'm just going to set it to a solid background of we're going to use the hex value for it. So to get your hex value, you use your color picker, select your element, and then inside your color picker you'll see your hex value right here. I'm going to be using F5. If it's 6 characters long, or hex values are 6 characters long. If it's something like white, which is 6 Fs, you can actually shorten it in your CSS rule down to 3. So if it's any sort of repeating, so it's primarily the basic ones, so like zeros all the way down is black. Yeah, and I can't remember exactly. Let's see here. Round F0. Okay, so it's so these two are the equivalent. So there is background shorthand that you can use, but in this case we are doing F5 for our background, which is a little bit of an off-white, and we're going to set our font at the body tag. Let's see here. Font stack. There is a website I was using. So it looks like it's cssfontstack.com. this is going to provide you all the web-friendly fonts. Great thing about this is that, for starters, they use Adobe Flash to copy to your clipboard. I haven't installed Flash on this machine yet, so but it also gives you the percentage of supported operating systems. So for instance, with Arial you get 98% Mac support and 99% Windows support. If we go over to everybody's favorite Helvetica, you get 100% Mac support and 7% Windows support. So yeah, this is a great tool to find web-friendly font stacks and not have to rely on a third party to import your font, which can be costly on bandwidth and load times. So I'm going to use a shorthand font property, which is, so how this works is that I believe it does your, so if we wanted bold text, we have bold right here, your font size, and then your line height, and that's how tall your lines are based on the font size. And I can show you, I'll show you that a little bit later. And then the last bit of the shorthand is your font family. So first we do Arial. If Arial doesn't exist on the machine, we do Helvetica, New or whatever the heck that is, and then we do Helvetica. Then we do sans serif as the absolute fallback. Alright, so that's our core body tag update. Let's go back to our index HTML and add our base style sheet, save it, and go back to the web page and hit F5, and so we see our font styles changed. If we inspect the element with Firebug and look at the body tag, we can verify that the rules are being applied. And so our next batch of elements, what I like doing at the very top of our base page, I want to hit some of our base level elements. And so one consistent thing we have across all of our header tags, for instance, that they're all uppercased. And so I am going to H1, H2, I'm going to plug in each one of the header tags, H3, H4, H5, and give them a text transform property of uppercase. So let's look what this, let's see what this does to our content. So we already have some uppercased elements, but it's going to take all of them and uppercase them for us. This allows us to have real flexible code. Now you may remember earlier I said we're going to have a highlight on each one of, let me kill some windows here. We have a highlight on some of our elements. So that this green right here. One thing I'm going to do is add a color key. There are CSS preprocessors that you can put these into variables. I don't care too much for preprocessors right now. I prefer old school. And so I'm going to create a color key up here because this shade of green is used all over the place. And then so this highlight we're doing is in an H2, it's in an H3, and an H4. So one thing that Visual Studio 2012 does for us is that it indents based on child selectors. So since this rule applies to the subsection of these, it's going to indent it for us. Adds a little bit of readability. Some people find it annoying. Personally, I feel like it reads a lot better. Later on, we are going to use a tool to minify all this, so the way it is right now shouldn't matter that much. So we're going to add our color, go back over to our CSS, or to our HTML, and see that it does work. Now we're going to get into the grit of our header, since we now have our basic element rules. And so inside of our CSS file, I'm going to create a CSS equivalent of a region, just bookmark it, so that whoever's coming behind us will know that all the rules inside this section are applied to the header. So we have a header tag. Now we are going to be floating some elements. Now floats can be real tricky, and one way to get so if we were to float both the graphics, the H1 to the left and our header to the right, if we were to do that, we would lose this whole section. It would collapse up on top of us and the graphics element. So it would, let's see here, it would look kind of like that. And so we're going to add a rule to the header of overflow hidden, and this allows the floats to appear as we want them to. Then we're going to add padding, since none of our content, with the exception of that over there, breaks boundaries from up down there or up there. We are going to add padding to force that, and so we have about 25 on top and about 30. Oh, it's 26. Oh, 26. We'll do. Oh, it's 25. We'll do 25. So padding, it's going to be 25 pixels with 0 left to right, and so padding has a shorthand, and so it goes top, right, bottom, left. Or you can do the way how we have it up here is that the first rule applies to the top and bottom, and then the second rule applies to left and right. Just for maintainability and readability, I recommend alphabetizing your CSS rules. That way, if you end up with a lot of rules for one selector, it's easy to find where your margin rules are or whatnot. So right now we're going to set up our rules for the header, the H1. It's going to have a background image. With our Visual Studio tool, we can actually just drag it, select it, and drag it in there into our CSS file, and it's going to resolve the file path for us. And as you see, we're using a relative file path instead of an absolute file path. Using an absolute file path would cause all sorts of problems if we move our site. I'm using an add-on called VS Web Essentials. I've done a video on it before, but when you highlight over or when you hover over an element, it's going to give you it's going to give you a preview of the image and its dimensions. It's also going to do it when you hover over it on your Solution Explorer. So anyway, the height of our image is 60 pixels and the width is 274. I'm going to set the height to 60 pixels. With this, we're going to do, with this element, we're going to do a text replace. So what we're going to essentially do is hide the text and present an image that contains the same text. We're not going to cheat and do content cramming or anything like that. Now to do this, it's here, and then this header tag is floating to the left of the whole thing. To do this, we're going to do overflow hidden, text indent 100%. What this is going to do is essentially push the text so far to the right that it's going to disappear from the page. There used to be a text indent minus 600 EMs or something like that, but it rendered iPads or it hindered the iPad performance pretty drastically, and so somebody pioneered this method, which is a lot easier. And then word wrap to no wrap. And so if we hop back over to our content, we're going to hit F5, and so you can see that we have our padding is in effect and our logo is replaced. Alright, now we have our nav element that we're gonna add some rules to. So it's header nav, and it's gonna float right. One second, real fast. Open this up in another browser just to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, I already see where I've missed something. Okay. So remember how I mentioned we are constrained to 960 pixels. We need to apply a rule to that first wrapping div. So inside of our base, inside the header, we're going to apply a immediate child selector. So this rule is only going to apply to the first level of divs. Child selectors like this are execute real fast. If we were to do this, the rule would apply to every single child div element, and we'd have to override any rules we put on it. And so we're going to go with this. We're going to set the margin 0 and auto. This center aligns it with 960. So what this does is it sets our width and center aligns it onto the page. So we can see that we hover over our element. Oh, kind of. It is going to, yeah, we have the 960 constraints on it. I wonder if I had that just on the wrong element. Overflow hidden. Let's apply that to this. Let's see if we get the highlighting we were expecting. Okay, so there we go. Now let's get our rules going for our navigation real fast. So we had a class of main menu. Going this route is going to give us kind of a new batch of selectors to work with. That way we're not going ridiculously, not doing header, nav, li. We're getting a little bit more readable selectors. So it's going to each element inside of our each one of these elements is going to float left. It's going to have a width of, let's see here, they're inconsistently have inconsistent widths on them. They don't exactly have the same padding, do they? That's close. For ease, we're just going to give them all the same width of 125. Float them left. Padding. I'm going to give them a padding top of, let's see, I'm going to move this guide up so that we can see like how much of a top space we have. So we have about 31 pixels. We'll look at it a little bit closer and let's just do 30 pixels. Since we don't have the exact matching font sizes, so they have 14 pixels, which Arial 14 pixels is actually a lot larger than what that one particular font is, so we may need to adjust that later. So we're on the LI, so we're going to text align right, and the reason we're going to do this is if we look at the PSDs, our contact is hiked all the way to the right. right next to our 960 restriction. And so each one of these elements, I was technically measuring them incorrectly, and so that's an element right there, and then this is going to be the next element. And with our width of 125 pixels. Now we're going to add classes to each one of our hyperlinks. So each one of the hyperlinks is actually black. So we need to override the default link hyperlink rules. So we're going to set the color to black, or 3 zeros. Font size to 14, which matches up to what the PSD was. Text decoration, none. This is going to remove that underline. And these were also all uppercase, which we copy and pasted uppercase. So we're going to do text transformation uppercase. Now, the one thing we sometimes still get will be underlines on them, but it doesn't look like we need to worry about that. If we were to, we want to add an underline to them so that, I mean, if you just hover over them, you don't realize it's a link. So I'm going to copy this rule, and we're going to add a pseudo selector of hover to it. So whenever a user hovers over this element, this CSS rule is going to apply. Underline. So as we hover over them, they're going to get that underline. Now we need to figure out why my elements aren't floating the way I thought they were going to. Let's see here. Select element, what were we missing? Nav. Stolen. I think I may have misspelled something somewhere. Oh, yep. My LIs have no rules being applied to them, so I've messed something up here. Menu instead of main menu. So there we go. We now have our header all set up. Now let's hop down to our footer. We only have still have quite a few rules to go, but we'll go through this real fast. So let's go ahead and set up our content item, since this is pretty generic. Let's go ahead and set it up. That way we have our margins of the 960 all in the same file, so if we ever have to change that, there's one location we find. So we're going to do content. Let's do margin 0 auto 140 pixels auto overflow hidden, and width 960. So the reason we add 140 pixels to the bottom is because we have this large white space right here, which is let's see here. It should be 104 for all that fun stuff. Let's just set 100. One thing to note by default, your Photoshop typically doesn't default to what you're going to want in terms of alignment and units and rulers. So your units need to be set to pixels, and then what was it? Fonts, I believe. Type is going to apply to your fonts. So anyway, this is going to get our content set up so that there's it's center aligned. the block is center aligned, our floats work properly, and the width matches up to everything else. So now we're gonna hit these base items back into our CSS, and we want to target our first footer, which has a class of just footer. Now it has a background of white. So to get that, we're just going to hit 3 Fs. We have a border top of 1 pixel, solid, and it's E9, E9, E9. So to get that, we are going to go into our PSD. Just by looking at it, we see it's 1 pixel tall. We use our color picker and select it. So it's EC9, but we'll just do E9, E9, E9 for ease. Essentially the same thing. And then it also looks like we have a bottom border also, right there, before our footer. So we can also apply that one. Now there's 2 ways to do this. We can copy and paste and do bottom, or we can do border, then do border left, border right. None. These are essentially the same thing. This block of code does the same thing this block of code does. Use whichever one you prefer. Oh. Spelling's fun. So anyway, yeah, the rule doesn't, whichever rule you decide to use doesn't really matter a whole lot. So use whatever you're comfortable with. We're going to clear both. This is going to ensure that no floating content right here overflows into our footer. We're also going to do overflow hidden so that our floating elements within the footer don't go all over the place. Then we have the footer content. No, that was right. Alright, so we had the margin of 0 auto. This is our typical wanting to align everything properly. Padding is going to be 40 pixels, 20 pixels, 0. Remember that zeros don't need to have the px unit on it. Width 960. Now this is, we're setting up our container right here. We had padding above it and padding below it. Now we want to write rules that target the first, each one of the first level layer divs. So we're going to use the child selector again. Each one is going to float left. It's going to have a margin right of 40 pixels. And its width is going to be 200 pixels. So we can get that by, let's see, which one? I believe it was this one that I used as a reference. They're not 100% precise, but so we had about, so it was 220. No, I'm sorry. We measured the distance of the bottom border, which is 197 pixels, so we rounded up to 200. And we measured an approximately the width between the two contents, which is 50 pixels, but 40 for good measure. Now we also need to style up each one of these headers, which are H5s. font size on them is going to be 15 pixels. If we go into our PSD and actually select them with the text selector, it's going to tell us it's 18 pixels. If we use 18 pixels Arial, it's going to be enormous, and it'll push our content around the way we don't want it to. So we're going to use font size 15 just for good measure. Each one has a margin bottom of about 25 pixels. And that should do it. That should make all those look consistent with our PSD. So we go back over here and F5. So at a glance, everything is looking up to snuff. One thing we need to do is style up this paragraph tag. So we're going to copy this and just replace the 5. Bottom. 25 pixels. Oh. So it gives us that 25 pixels margin bottom. And so what I'm going to show you right now real fast is how line height works. We're just going to use the Firebug editor for this. Excuse me. So I'm going to add a property here of line height. Now you can either do pixels or EMs, which EMs is relative to I believe it's relative to the font that's being applied to it. So if we do 1.1 EM, it's what it is right now, and so if we do go up to 2 EMs, we see that the vertical space in between each line is drastically increased. So 1.1 adds just a little bit extra in there to allow enough reading space in there. For usually paragraph tags are going to have a larger EM than say header tags or anyone's. So if we do 1.5 EMs, it's going to give us a real good, better readability on it. Since it's not really required for this, we're just going to go ahead and avoid it and continue to move on. So we have just the basics of the base footer wired up. Let's see here, inspect element. What was missing from the social links? Oh, okay. Alright, so my social links were in the wrong spot in my other project. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and do those social links real fast before we do the base footer. We had a class of social links on it. Let's look at the HTML for it real fast. So we have social links. We have an unordered list with a class that's based on all of our specific social networks. So we are going to target each one of the list items. We're going to use a different approach for lining them up in a line instead of using floats. We're going to display inline block. This is only valid, I believe, from HTML, or I'm sorry, IE8 and above. It'll take your elements and essentially line them up in a straight line. Traditionally, you have to float them. This is a little bit easier, so you don't have to worry about clearing it or issues with float, which floats can be tricky at times. It's definitely something you have to experiment with and definitely check out each browser. Now, inside of our PSD, the consistent height and width, or the largest height and width of each one of these is about 25 pixels. That gives us the distance between each element so that they line up properly. So each one of them, we're going to set the height and width to 25 pixels. We're going to set the background position to center, Now what this is going to do is actually force the background image to position directly center. This is really the only way you can vertically center something, vertically align an image easily. And we're also going to set the background repeat to none. That way we don't get a bunch of weird looking, oh, it's no repeat, I'm sorry. We don't get the larger or the smaller images repeating on itself. And we're going to set the hyperlinks to display block so that they will show the whole image. I'm going to copy and paste in all my social links paths. So this is referencing the Facebook, RSS, Vimeo, all that fun stuff, just for time reasons. And when we refresh the page, we get our links for each one of those. Alright, let's code out our base footer real fast. Our base footer is, so here it's approximately 25 pixels tall. We will control this with padding. So it looks like there's about 10 pixels padding to the top and 8 pixels padding to the bottom. We'll go ahead and just use 10 pixels. So the background on it is actually not black, it is an off black. So 2020. Set that. I'm going to set the top and bottom padding to 10 pixels and the left and right padding to 0. And as always, with a wrapping element with, well, no, we don't need to apply to this one. We need to set our footer content, which is going to restrict the width of the. It's going to restrict the width of that bottom content to 960 pixels. We'll have a margin 0 and auto to center align it, and overflow so that the elements don't look ridiculous. It's your dot base footer footer nav. These are going to be the links right here. They're going to be white, and we'll keep them the default font size. We need to float each one of them left. I'm going to copy this rule and add the hyperlink tag to it. So their color is white. And we're going to set a left to right padding of 5 pixels. This is going to add this extra space right there. So that's about 10 pixels. So the actual element is about that size. Maybe a little more, a little less. But it's going to give it horizontal width. So it's a little bit easier read. Set the text decoration to none. And text transform to uppercase. And we need to update, or we need to set the copyright one also. So color needs to be set to white. And we're going to float it right. We're going to refresh our page and hope, yep, it looks like everything's set up just right. We're going to close Firebug so that we make sure that everything is good. Maybe a little difficult to fully see the whites and the borders and everything, but everything is looking like it's lining up properly. Looks like our padding down here isn't working right, or we have an off. Oh, looky there. So So that's an area where I need to add that overflow hidden to. So footer content. Oh, wait, no, hold on, sorry. Footer. Alright, so everything lines up just fine. We're not going to do the elements right there just for time reasons. And then our footer's all set up. Alright, that was a bit longer than I was expecting, but we now have the core CSS for our site. We should be able to get the rest of these, the rest of the site styled up almost as fast, maybe a little bit longer since we're going to be still working with a lot of floating elements. The important thing is to always experiment, triple check yourself in each browser. Since this is just a demo, we're only going to be doing Firefox, but check IE, check Firefox, check Chrome, check all your commonly used browsers, yeah, try and write CSS that's readable and maintainable. Name stuff, what it looks like, keep it descriptive. Most importantly, write it in a way that you're proud of it. So, alrighty, that's it for this one. On the next one, we'll be styling up the center content. After that, we will be writing a jQuery plugin for the rotator, and then doing some optimization after that. So, I appreciate the view. Please leave any feedback, and we will see you guys on the next one.